You're listening to Creatives Off Script, presented by Assemble, a podcast where we learn process from inside the world's most successful creative organizations. I'm your host, Nate Watkin, and today we're speaking with Dmitry Shamis, Global Head of Creative at HubSpot.
You have to change the way you operate. You have to change the way you think. You have to rebuild things. We learn that, you have to bring people along with you.
Welcome to our show, Dmitry.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Nate.
Yeah, great to see you. So we originally connected, 4 or 5 years ago, Brand Week, Palm Springs. Who was it? Who was performing?
Oh, it was Swiss Beats.
Swiss Beats. Yeah, that was a fun night. But good to see you again. Excited to catch up. Going to spend the first part of the interview just talking a little bit about your career, and then after that, want to dive into process. I know you're big on process. I follow you on LinkedIn, and I'm excited to hear a lot of your experience and thoughts on that side of things. But to start off, would love to learn about your career. I saw an interesting note when researching your history. It looks like, I think this is interesting because a lot of our viewers are in the film space, but it looks like you started your career as a PA. Is that true?
Yeah. So I was in school at NYU for sports management, and it was like this really fun kind of thing where like I'd get to go to like basketball games and hockey games and meet like coaches and things like that. And somewhere along the line, I was just like, hey, I don't actually like the business of sports side of things. I'm like 18, 19 years old. Like I just want to go watch the Knicks win. And I kind of like made a pivot. So I stuck it out with like sports and entertainment marketing, but I focused more on the entertainment side of things. And so I started like applying for internships at TV networks and at film studios and whatnot. And I ended up at Spike TV, which I think is the Paramount network now. It might have been rebranded again since, but they hosted several award shows, and they hosted a few like of their own like original programs at the time. And yeah, I was able to get in and run coffee and do all sorts of like random stuff, and it was a ton of fun. And I was like 19 years old in Las Vegas, hanging out with like celebs and not knowing what to do with myself. It was awesome.
Nice. Yeah, that's cool to know that you have a little bit of background in media or production. But sounds like your dream, as I understand, was to be a sports agent originally, and you started at the mailroom in Paradigm and worked your way up. Tell me a little bit about that experience, but like mainly, what was the biggest learning that you have from that looking back?
For sure. Yeah. So, I wanted to, I watched Jerry Maguire one too many times and wanted to be a sports agent. Realized, as I mentioned, the sports side necessarily wasn't for me, but like there was still a lot of cool work that I could do where I could apply the education experience that I was picking up. And so I ended up in the mailroom at Paradigm, which was awesome. And it was like this, it started as an unpaid internship before turning into a role. And like I was just like I was in the back, I was binding scripts, I was sending out, headshots and resumes. I was recording like VOs and audition tapes with like celebs who were, auditioning for different parts. And it was just really, really cool. And, like looking back on those times now, the thing that I probably took away the most was just a general sense of like accountability. Like up until that point, it was like, oh, well, this person might be at fault, or, this wasn't me, this wasn't them. And like this unfortunate incident happened, which I still, to this day, I don't think it was on me, but we were asked to ship the CEO's laptop from the New York office to the LA office because he was in town and had to do some travel and he just didn't want to bring it with him. Right. And it ends up in LA, just like smashed to bits. And, it's like my boss at the time, he comes over and he's like, what happened? What's going on there? And it was just like, I don't know. Like I wrapped it up. I used all the best materials. I taped the box together, did all of these great things. And sure enough, the thing was busted anyway, right? Regardless if it was my fault or not. Like, I don't know what happened, but it was at that point where it was just like, well, you know what? I got to take ownership of this, and whatever happens. And, fortunately they were able to laugh about it, and, he got a new laptop and everything was okay. But from that point forward, it was just like, all right, when you do something, you got to take ownership of it. You got to be accountable for the results, positive or negative, and you got to learn from it. And, to this day, many, many years later, that's a moment I still think about pretty often.
Yeah. important lesson. And for some reason, I'm picturing Ari Gold in my head, getting a smashed laptop in the mail. So glad to hear it was handled a little more gracefully than Ari would have handled it. But
For sure.
so spent a number of years at Paradigm, and then just took like a hard left in terms of your career. Tell me about that change and how you ended up at HubSpot.
Yeah. So, like most rational human beings in the entertainment industry, I decided to just quit my job one day and learn how to code. And really, like, that came from a place of misunderstanding on my part, truth be told, where I had started looking for my next role. Like, broadcast television was great, but I just knew that it wasn't for me in the long run. It wasn't where I wanted to spend, the rest of my career. So I was interviewing with like the big tech companies at the time, and they started asking me questions about, technology, about development, engineering, and you know, I mistook that for like, do you know how to code? And I don't know, maybe it was just kind of like what I wanted to hear because like, also over the years, I've always had an interest in development. I've always wanted to know how it works. I've just genuinely always had a curiosity about how things work and how things get put together. And like back in the day, like middle school, like I'd be building like garbage GeoCities websites and things like that. Like, so it was one of those moments where it was like, all right, well, they're asking about this. I'm kind of curious about it. Should I go for it? And I did. And it was wild. It was just like a completely different world, very different philosophies, different ways of thinking that I still use today. Like, the way you approach problems, the way you break them down, the way you kind of solve one thing after the other, as opposed to just like trying to do everything all at once. And after learning code, I did some freelance work. I was at a ecom shop in New York, and I got a jury duty summons of all things. And so like I'm sitting there in jury duty, waiting to get called, not knowing what the next day or week or months of my life are going to look like. And I get this LinkedIn message and was like, all right, let's see what this is all about. And it was from someone I'd never met at a company I'd never heard of that was located in Boston. Uh, Decided to respond, hopped on a call the next day. Within 10 days, I had a job offer and had to be up in Boston because the company wasn't as remote friendly yet at the time. Um, and it was time to get to work. So it was like this very kind of like fortuitous turn of events where if I'm not sitting in that like jury pool room, I may not have answered that LinkedIn message and nothing would have happened or none of this would have happened. So I get to HubSpot. I'm, a developer at the time. I'm one of two there. And it was just really like this kind of like eye-opening moment where, I had learned a ton about the company up until like at that point. I'd gone through the interview process and was really like blown away and excited. Look at all these motivated people. They're all so ambitious. Like this company is going to change the game. And I got there and like the work just wasn't that. And that was my moment to kind of step in and be like, we can do better. This is how we're going to do better.
Very cool. And so you worked as a software engineer and rapidly climbed the ranks there at HubSpot. And then I think it's interesting that you were then promoted into the creative team and eventually global head of creative. Like, what does that say about HubSpot's culture that they made a software engineer their head of creative?
I mean, one of HubSpot's big philosophies is like, when everyone zigs, you zag. And, I think there's this kind of old fashioned mindset around creative traditionally where it's just like, it's based on TV commercials, it's based on print ads, it's based on like billboards and out of home. And for some businesses, like for sure, that's the thing, that's what you need. But for modern tech companies, media companies, all right, someone sees that billboard, someone sees that print ad, someone sees that TV commercial. What happens next? You have to provide this like world-class digital experience. You have to think about what happens like post-click or post view. And that was an opportunity where like between my like background in entertainment where I was building brands for my clients at the time to that point in time where like I had built these really strong relationships across the board with our design team, with our video team, with our project managers, with like the functional marketing leaders. It was one of those things that just made sense, and I also pitched the hell out of it, which was I think worked out in my favor. But ultimately, like they took a chance and they zagged when other people would have zigged and said, let's just hire that like traditional kind of like CD type. And, I'd like to think it's been pretty successful.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely has been successful. And yeah, I've read a lot on HubSpot. I find them to be a fascinating company. I've read the culture code. I've read the sales acceleration formula. And, one thing I noticed, especially about that book, the sales acceleration formula, who was written by the guy that built the sales organization, name escapes me at the moment, but I believe he was a software engineer as well. And his approach to building out the sales team and hiring and analyzing success and everything struck me very much as how a software engineer would think about solving this problem, which I found fascinating. Just from your time working at HubSpot, like what's your biggest takeaway from their culture? What do you find most interesting about the culture there?
I think, and it's a slightly double-edged sword, but I think autonomy and transparency are just like so crucial. And those are two things that HubSpot has always leaned in on, like giving people enough room to be creative, to try to problem solve, to do what they need to do to be successful, and just like keep everyone in the loop about it. Um, you know, the transparency side of things is sometimes good, sometimes bad, in the sense that like sometimes, you don't have anything to share, and that could be like debilitating to a certain extent, but like that's the expectation. And at the same time, like on the autonomy side, like there sometimes people just go heads down and run at something, and you you don't know when they're going to pick their head back up, and like if someone else might be doing the thing as well. But ultimately, like the results of autonomy and transparencies like are really strong, really positive. And I think HubSpot and the culture code, like they very much facilitate that and advocate for those two things specifically. And those just run through every part of the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. And so let's talk about what you did in this creative role. It's pretty incredible. So you're brought in to the creative role. I believe you start with just a handful of team members on that. Eventually, grow it up to 140 employees on your team. Also, originally a service-based group, you led the change to transition into an in-house agency model. Can you tell me a little bit about like the before and after, like from a process standpoint, organizationally, how that services based group changed, turning into an in-house agency, and what kind of change that you led?
For sure. Yeah. So like, the initial expectation, this is literally like even from like day one for me as an individual contributor, was like someone has a need. The expectation is that you deliver on that need, no questions asked. And, sometimes the briefs were strong. Sometimes the data and the insights were there. Sometimes it was clear what we were doing, why we were doing it. But in a lot of cases, that wasn't the case. And so like you were essentially asked to do something, not because it'll work or because that's what the audience is looking for today. You were asked to do the thing because no one had an idea on what you could do that was different or innovative. And this recipe worked in the past, essentially. So, you know, from a creative standpoint, that gets old, right? Like you want to do things that are different. You want to do things that are innovative. But also like from a marketing standpoint, like it's really easy to fatigue your audience. Like if you just keep hitting them with like ebook after ebook after ebook, they're not going to want to read that like anymore. They're not going to want to keep filling out forms. They're not going to want to keep doing just the same thing over and over. So, we had this process where you could submit a creative request, and it was a Google form tied to like, Zapier that like pushed things into the right place or the right project in Jira. And it was like first in, first out. And for some people that was great, but like when we're sitting there designing stickers and that's holding up like the launch of a new feature or product, that doesn't really look good for anyone, frankly. So we really needed to think through, how we prioritize what work we take on, what work we don't take on, frankly, as well, and how to like get people who are used to just having everything they want done, be okay with the fact that that's not the case anymore, and that there are probably going to be alternative ways to get that done. So, what we ended up doing was finding some strong partners, some strong stakeholders who aligned with our vision, who were like, hey, these are our goals. These are the data points we have. These are the insights we have. we know there's something better than what we've been doing. And so we work closely with those partners to really level up the work to say, hey, okay, so this report, for instance, what if we what if we did a physical printout of it? What if we actually did a book and hand deliver that to people because we haven't done that before? Or like, what if we take this and do a video series instead of just written content? What if we don't gate this and make this available to everyone, but then create like a follow-up offer? And we would look across the creative team and like rely on the functional experts, the domain experts, and say, okay, well, here's the problem that we're trying to solve. What should we be doing from a design standpoint? What should we be doing from a video standpoint? What should we be doing from a dev standpoint? And like, there were things that made sense and there are things that didn't. And, we had to figure that out. But ultimately, the projects that we ended up working on with those stakeholders became way stronger. And as they started, singing our praises, other stakeholders would see that the value in partnership is much greater than the value in just like service. And we started kind of just building bridges across the leadership team, and that worked out in our favor in a lot of ways because we helped with prioritization in different kind of fashion, in the sense of like we'd be in those conversations where it was like, hey, this idea that you're trying to come up with, that's really cool. What you're talking about is going to take 6 months of work, and you're trying to launch in 3 weeks. Not going to work, not going to happen. Because in the past it would have been like, here's the ticket, we need this work in 3 weeks, and you'd be like, I can't help you there, and like, you're the bad guy. So by getting involved sooner through that partnership, all of a sudden, like, you could actually provide different kinds of context, you could provide different levels of detail, you could provide alternative viewpoints that people didn't have, that kind of set you up for success. Because you know what, maybe launching in 6 months with this like better asset pack or whatever you want to call it, like, will actually do much better for the business than launching in 3 weeks with some like mediocre thing that we have to just like, clump together at the last minute. So, we revised our processes, we revised our prioritization model, we revised the meeting structure that we were involved in, both from a leadership standpoint within the creative and brand realm, but also like with the actual like creatives and the makers who are doing the work, where it's just like, you need to be in this kickoff. You need to understand what the different goals are, because otherwise you're not going to have any of the context to be successful. And that pivoted into like a whole different model where we started to really rethink. And again, this goes back to the point on like what work we do and what work we don't do. But it kind of just changed the game for us, because when you're on an in-house team, when you run an in-house team, when we work with an in-house team, the expectation is that that in-house team is going to do 100% of the work all of the time. But I feel like that's like super flawed thinking, because one, there's always more work than there are people, right? And there's more work than there is time in the day. But also, not all of the work deserves to get done in the way that folks might expect it to. Like, that's not to say that the work isn't impactful to the business. It's not to say the work isn't important. It still is. But like, if you figured out how to do the work, right? Like, I talk about playbooks a lot. Like, if you figured out what the playbook is for a certain work stream, there's absolutely no reason why you need to keep like recreating the wheel every time. Like, follow the playbook, automate it if you can, outsource it, do whatever it takes, so that you could then create more room for yourself to actually think about that next big problem, that next big question, that next big swing. Because I don't know, like, I think a lot of people focus so much on keeping the lights on that they forget why they're keeping the lights on in the first place. So that the transition partnership really helped just like open eyes in a big kind of way around to like how we should be thinking about creative work in general.
So if I'm hearing this right, it sounds like when you first stepped into the creative group, it was more of a services model, in the sense of like almost order takers, like, hey, we need
Yes.
our 350th ebook, like get us this by Friday. And you
Yes.
instead said, hey, we want to actually drive creative, drive strategy, be the team that is pushing out creative strategy into the organization. Is that correct?
Mhm. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, amazing. And so, even though you had over 100 people on that team, massive in-house operation, sounds like you're relying on a number of external partners. And you talk a lot about the creative 2x2 and really how to manage that creative output. Would love if you could maybe pull that up and just walk us through a little bit of your thinking on that.
Yeah, for sure. I would absolutely love to. So this is the creative 2x2 that Nate mentioned. I've since come up with a better name for it. I'm trying to call it the scaling creative framework. And it is a 2x2 matrix based off of like two axes. So the first one is work that is creative driven versus creative supported, meaning creative driven means like that actual like in-house creatives are involved in the process versus creative supported, which means that the in-house creative team is responsible for creating the systems and the tooling for the creative work to be done. And then the other axis, so creative driven to creative supported is like the y-axis, so up down. The x-axis, left right, is whether the work gets done externally within the, externally or internally. So externally meaning with like vendors and agencies, internally with the in-house team versus like any kind of like self-service systems you might be putting together. So, I mean, let's start with the bottom half of the matrix. Then you have your approved vendors and your self-service systems. So self-service is, I think, the kind of like linchpin to scaling, to doing more work than you have people or time for. And the way you do that is by not doing the work yourself, by asking the people who are requesting the work to actually do it themselves. And so this is something that takes a long time to build, but it's pretty phenomenal if we're being honest. So as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, right? Like there's certain work that's just run rate work. It's incredibly impactful to the business, but it's not the best use of a creative's time. It takes as much time as something as some sort of as a bigger bet or an experiment or something that you don't know how it's going to result. And ultimately, instead of doing that like experiment or pulling for a big bet, you are stuck doing the run rate work and you're just growing, hopefully incrementally at best. And for any kind of like truly scaling organization team that's trying to do more, that's trying to punch above their weight, however you want to frame it up, you've got to be taking those big swims. You've got to be looking for those opportunities to do things differently. So self-service systems are a great way to do that. So at HubSpot, the way we approached this was kind of in a threefold manner. So first was around design. So we had built this fantastic Canva instance. Our head of design, our designers were all fantastic and really took to this in the sense that like we need to build a system where we're marketers and just like everyone at the company, frankly, because these tools were used across the sales team, across the people team, product was using them, like finance was using them. It just became one of those things where everyone saw the value after a certain point. But so created, hundreds of templates, across our different branding, sub-branding types, with multiple variable or variants. And they created in a way where the opportunities were still flexible so that, the people using these tools could still be successful and not feel super limited, but also in a way that was also aligned completely with our brand guidelines. From not just from like a color and type standpoint, but also just from an accessibility standpoint, from from a messaging standpoint as well. Like, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the crux of any kind of good relationship with vendors, with self-service systems, with frankly with anyone, is like a very strong set of brand guidelines and vendor guidelines, helping your partners truly understand what it is you're trying to achieve and the ways in which you are trying to achieve those things. So, the brand guidelines feed into the design system. And I think like as of most recently, the team is pumping out like a couple hundred design assets a month at least. I'm trying to be conservative in my estimate. Like I know there are months where it was literally thousands as well, but like that's hundreds or thousands of assets that the in-house team is now not producing, but that are still getting done, that are getting done at a level that we're comfortable and confident with. And, that go to market 10 times quicker than if they went through our intake process and then were routed and vetted and briefs were built and all of the things that now happened. Because like the days of the intake form where it's just like first in, first out are now gone. It's just like we have to think about things in a different kind of way. But that helped like really scale design in a major way.
First of all, it's amazing. So it sounds like you built this whole brand design system mainly in Canva, if I heard that correctly. Um,
Yes.
Curious for more rich assets, like you're getting into actual like video content, photography, maybe even recording podcasts and putting together those assets. Did you ever crack the code on that, or did that more complicated assets go back to the in-house creative team typically?
So it's a bit of both. Unlike the photography, we would take time to do at least quarterly photo shoots, and we like another part of the self-service system is like the digital asset management system that you have. So we would make sure that all of the assets in the dam were as up to date as possible. We would retire old assets. We would make sure that just like the team had everything they needed, because there was a world where someone just downloaded the HubSpot logo onto their desktop in year X, and that was the same logo that they've been using for years. Meanwhile, that logo had been actually like retired or updated multiple times over that period. So like creating this like one destination where we could say like, here are all of the word marks, here are all of the logos, here are all of the like illustrations and product graphics and photos essentially as well, like was so key. And there were like 3,000 users or approaching that as of recently as well, which is awesome. But like that's where we would put the photos, and we made sure that everyone had access to them. Everyone knew how to use them. They were, before getting uploaded, they were all edited to ensure that they like fit in with our brand guidelines as well. So, the team had access to like thousands of different photos to at any given point. For things like video and audio podcast production, like it really kind of depends. So this is where part of the playbook question comes into play, where it's like, do we know what we're actually doing there? And if the answer is no, then that work lives with, yes, the in-house creative team. So we could figure out what that work looks like. What is the ideal workflow? Who, do we have the skill set internally? Can we do this work, or do we need to outsource it? Once we have those questions answered, then it's like, okay, we've done a few of these. Should we keep doing them? One, because like it's working or it's not working, but two, like, is this the best use of time as well? So, in those instances where we say, yes, we should keep doing them, the work stays with the in-house team. Where we say, you know what, this is awesome, this is highly impactful, and we need to, as a business, keep doing this, but we could spend our creative energy elsewhere. That's where we work with the team to find the vendors that we, work most closely with, that align with our values, that, understand our guidelines and expectations. We would assign a producer to the work internally to make sure that there's like motion and that everything's getting delivered correctly. But that's work that we would ultimately say, we built the playbook for this. We know what the impact is on the business. Let's outsource it so that it continues to go on, and then we'll move on to the next thing.
Nice. Yeah, I got to shout out my friend's company. My friend Champ runs a company called Capsule. Not sure if you've heard it, but on the video note, they enable you to build those brand guidelines, but in video form, so that people from different departments can create video content just like on their laptop or their mobile phone, and then everything is true to brand. So yeah, a lot of really cool tools out there in this space.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. So from here, from the scaling creative framework, so we talked about self-service. How about in-house creative team? Like let's drill in there. I'd love to hear, first of all, what makes the cut to say, okay, we're going to take this in-house versus self-service or approved vendors, and what does that process look like internally? And also, what kind of capabilities do you have internally? Are you producing commercial grade video content, or does that get shipped out to your agency partners?
So, I mean, that's actually a really great question, and a really good kind of like foundational point within like the top half of the matrix, where like what stays in and what doesn't. And skill set is like a really, really big part of it. There are things that we have the capacity for. There are things that we have the experience with and the knowledge with, right? And so like, just to dive in there for a sec, like, The creative team at HubSpot is divided into three pillars. So the creative studio, digital experience, and creative operations. So within the studio, that's where we have our visual design work, our graphic design. We have video, like cinematography, editing, motion graphics. We have creative direction, copywriting, and like a lot of the brand work lives there as well. Then within digital experience, that's where the developers live, the engineers, because also like the team has grown at such a pace that we now need engineers to actually facilitate the dev work, which is awesome. And so that's really kind of like core continuous integration work and things of that nature. Also QA and testing work. And then we have UX and UI design that also live there. So it's like this much closer partnership between the front end devs and the UX and UI designers. And then within operations, that's where if it wasn't for creative ops, I don't know what anyone would do, frankly. But that is our project management team. That is our production team. That's resource management. That's also like creative solutions. And creative solutions is the group that's responsible for the self-service systems. So lots of strategy, lots of execution. And then, going back to your question, while we're good at all of those things to a certain level, like I don't know that the team can make a Super Bowl commercial. And I don't think that's from lack of ability, but also just like there are just certain things that we don't have or didn't have at the company where it was like, well, I don't have payroll, I don't have business affairs, I don't have like some of these just like core functions that are required to make a Super Bowl ad or a proper TV ad. So it made more sense to outsource those and work with the teams that do this day in and day out to be successful. But when it comes to like content creation, when it comes to tools and different digital like resources, like we are the best. And you gotta I'd love to say that there's just this like defining kind of decision making tree or something within the framework that says this work lives in this bucket versus that bucket. But like you also have to just honestly take a look at what is coming through and take a look at your bandwidth, take a look at your resourcing, take a look at your skill sets. And if if there's alignment across all three of those, like that should live in-house, especially if that work is seen as an opportunity for doing something bigger and more innovative and something that could be a really big kind of like exponential growth point. And if it doesn't work out in terms of those three questions, like then it's okay to outsource it as well, so long as you have the budget and the ability to facilitate. Because like the reason why like agencies and production studios are in the top half of the matrix versus the bottom half of the matrix is because that's still like creative work in the sense that there's a lot of strategy that's required. There's lots of alignment. There's other stakeholders that are generally involved. And so we do still, like similar to how we'll have producers on the work that it gets done by the approved vendors, like we'll have our CDs, or our like head of studio, or head of digital experience, or head of ops, like associated with the work that's going on with the agencies and production studios. So it's not just like, we can't do it, like throw it over the fence, let someone else do it. Like we're still very deeply involved. We just may not be the makers behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. And so let's talk a little bit about that process. I know you're big on playbooks. I imagine you've designed quite a system for that global creative team. But tell me about the process when a brief comes in or when an idea comes in. What does that decision making tree look like?
Sure. So, I mean, that was like the best tee up ever, I think, because like this deck also has something like we put together called like the creative workflow chart. And so ultimately, like whenever an idea comes into play, the goal is to send it through self-service. Like if it can be done through self-service, that's usually the best bet. It's on brand, it's quick, it's easy to go to market, and it's a great place to like learn. Because I think what I've been seeing a lot in this industry is that people forget the MVP of whatever it is that they might be doing. And they just jump into like the V1 or even sometimes straight to V2. And like, you don't even know the thing is going to work. Like, why are you going to spend weeks and months on a project that you can't possibly know what the end result is going to be? So if there's a world where you can push people into self-serve, that's a win because you're learning almost immediately. And then you can make a decision as to like, oh, you know what? This thing actually is something, this idea is worth the time and the energy. Let's build it out. Let's pump it up. Let's now build this like true V1 so we could test it in a bigger way and build a campaign around it and do all these other cool things with it.
Mm.
So we try to pump people into self-service, and it's not from like a lazy standpoint. It's just like I said, let's get the data. If the work that we
Sorry, I want to jump in here real quick because I think that's really interesting. You're taking the agile product development methodology and mirroring that on the creative side as well. It sounds like, and saying get an MVP out, test it, get the data, and if it's worth further investment, then we'll talk. Essentially,
That's exactly it. Where, you look at, I alluded to it earlier, but as efficient as your intake process might be, as efficient as your prioritization process might be, like the second something goes into a queue, it's in a queue, regardless of anything. Because even if you're at the top of the line, there's still something that's getting finished ahead of you, like ahead of your work, ahead of your request. So if there's a mechanism for you to just get it out and into the world, like why wouldn't you try that? Why wouldn't you take that opportunity? If your content is that strong, if your idea, if you believe in it that much, like you should be able to spend the like, half hour it'll take to get the thing out the door to see if it's actually real. And so, yeah, the agile methodology here makes a ton of sense for me because most things in marketing are an experiment. Most things in marketing, like you're trying to figure out if there's an audience for it, and that's when you invest once you know. So like I feel like a lot of the time people make these investments before knowing the audience actually exists, before knowing the strategy is worth pursuing. And so, yeah, this is something I've always kind of believed in. And like literally going back to my first days at HubSpot, where it was just like, we're building another ebook landing page. Like, are you serious? Like, why not just use a template? Like we just update the image, update the link, update the copy, like you're good to go. I don't understand why we have to like redo this. And once we started doing that, like, yeah, we got more ebooks out the door. We started generating more leads and building more offers, and it was awesome. And so like to be able to transition that to like more creative disciplines is I don't know, I'm biased, but I think it's super cool. And
and
again, that gives you then a lot more focus on the bigger projects.
yeah, and one last question here on the self-serve model. Is that completely autonomous in the sense like do you even track the content being created through the self-serve model or like have any sort of final sign off or approval? Or is it completely autonomous in that anyone can come and go into those design assets, create them, put them out, and that exists almost as its own automated system?
It's completely autonomous. So, within like the design side of things, so Canva does a really good job of letting you build brand kits and limiting how much damage can be done essentially from a brand design standpoint. So yeah, will everything be perfect? No, but we've essentially built the system out to a point where like at worst everything's going to be at like 90-95% of where it could and should be. And you know what? That's pretty good. Same thing on the dev side where like, we've built this fantastic system within the HubSpot CMS where, we give marketers and everyone access to like 40 some odd web modules that are like flexible and mold essentially into whatever it is you need them to be for the content that you're trying to put out there. And everything is responsive, everything is accessible, everything is on brand, everything is like everything that I would want these assets to be. So again, like there's a level of trust because, I've essentially built the system, the team really, like, it's easy for me to take credit, but like the team has built the tools in a way that, limit how bad something could potentially be, although like people will always surprise you. But ultimately when there's a will, there's a way. But yeah, so ultimately everything meets the threshold that we're happy with, which enables this autonomous system. And while, yeah, you offer enablement materials, training materials, Loom videos, you create office hours and opportunities on Slack channels for people to ask questions. Like you make yourself available because if people don't know how to use these things and don't feel comfortable, they're never going to use them. So you want to be, you want to be there for them. You want to support your colleagues, your teammates. You want them to be successful, because if they're successful, you're successful, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's fully autonomous.
Nice. Okay. And so jumping over to the no side of this creative flow chart, let's talk about how something goes through the process of coming to the in-house team.
Yeah. So if you can't use self-service resources, and there's like, there's a question around like, do you have budget as well, right? Like it's part of the no camp, but that there's a world where, those self-service vendors, or like those approved vendors, like someone could go to them as well if the ask is a bit too complex. But that, we help with that decision. So ultimately, like when someone submits a request through our intake process, every part of the marketing business has a project management leader associated with that world. So, customer marketing has a request, or acquisition has a request, content has a request, from whomever it might be, that gets funneled directly to that project management leader. That project management leader, along with the PMs on the individual PMs on the team, they essentially build out the brief with the stakeholder who is making the request. And, depending on, again, bandwidth, depending on skill sets, depending on budget, depending on also priority, right? Because like the content lead, for instance, could have 5, 6, 10 different requests. So, you're never going to be able to work on all of those projects simultaneously. So it's like, okay, we took a brief look at all of these, like these two will take, 3 weeks, these two will take 6 months, these two will take, whatever it might be. And you have that conversation around like, all right, well, we can knock out a few of these like low hanging fruit tasks. But that 6-month project is going to get delayed as a result of that. Like, what is that going to do for the business? What is the impact that will create? And you talk it through with your partner to essentially come up with a game plan and say, okay, these are the ones we're going to do in-house. These are the ones we're going to outsource. These are the ones we're going to put on the back burner for later, and see if like time opens up, or if any, resources come available. And like, once you have that game plan together, it's actually pretty straightforward, because you just get to work at that point. But like, there's a lot of legwork up front to ensure that you're doing the right work, that you understand the work that you're doing, that you're also making a like real business impact, because you don't want to waste time. It's so easy to like lose ground, and if you're not working on the right things, you're gonna miss out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's interesting. And we talked about that a bit, is what is the actual business impact of this? So you're not, once again, acting as an order taker, you're really getting involved in the strategy and kind of stress testing their ideas and their assumptions to make sure that it's worth the investment of the in-house team. Is that right?
100%. I mean, I think it's really important that creatives understand the business. You have like, and not just like things are going bad, things are going good. Like, you have to understand what your product is, or your service is. You have to understand what the features and benefits are. You have to understand what makes you stand out from your competition, because all of that is going to make your work better. If you actually understand why you're doing something, what the impact is, you have a different level of ownership. And a different level of involvement. It's not just like, all right, fine, I got to close this ticket and move on. It's no, okay, this is why we're doing this thing. This is how I think we can improve. This is where I think we might be missing something. This is where like my domain expertise actually enables me to see something that someone who doesn't have that domain expertise doesn't see, that I can now bring to the table. If you don't have that, then you're truly just like, you're just delivering something to a certain spec, and you don't know if it works or not. And I think like, in the agency world, everyone cares. Everyone wants to be successful. Everyone wants to make sure that the work that they're doing turns into something valuable, right? But also like, you got to move from client to client, because that's the nature of the business. On the in-house side of things, like, your client doesn't change. Your client doesn't disappear. Like your client sits in the chair right next to you, so to speak. So like, you have to understand the impact of the work that you're doing in a different kind of way, because you're embedded in a very different kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to talk a moment about tooling for all this, I mean, you're managing a pretty complex workflow here in terms of like creative briefs being submitted, going to the team, just allocating that to whatever resources are available to create that content. Just curious, like what kind of actual software tooling are you using to manage this? Do you have something to see like a bird's eye view of your entire production pipeline, or like what does that look like?
Yeah, we are reliant on Asana and Jira for most of that. So our intake system is built off of Asana. HubSpot at one point basically decided that we are going to move all of marketing, project management, and work, whether it's creative or not, into Asana. And that's because like there are people just, some folks are in Jira, some folks are using Airtable, some folks are using Trello, some folks are just, using like a Google spreadsheet. So there was no kind of centralized view of everything that was going on. So we had made the investment to build out like this really, really strong Asana integration essentially into the marketing team. And, the project managers on creative built out these like fantastic, they're essentially forms, but just like really thorough, great forms that didn't take a long time to fill out, but gave you like that first like V1 lightweight brief of whatever request is. So everything fed into Asana. We could see what our backlog was. We could see what was happening within the current sprints. We could see what was launching when and where, what was on time, or what was on track, what wasn't. And that was really helpful. Like from a developer workflow standpoint, Jira is still more effective. So there was a little bit of duplication of efforts in that, like, we would still have tickets that lived in both Jira and Asana that were literally the exact same ticket. But, you just don't, sometimes you want to mess with process. Sometimes it's not worth it. And, we had run a pilot of getting the devs over to Asana and it didn't pan out in the way we wanted to. So it ended up being easier to have two tickets rather than like asking them to just like fully blow up everything that they were doing. So
Yeah, hard to decouple that when it comes to engineering for sure, as I'm sure you
yeah,
know. Um, Amazing. Well, yeah, I really appreciate you taking us through that. A lot of learnings, especially for anybody working on an in-house team like yours. I guess my next question would be looking back over your time running this global creative team, what would you say are your biggest learnings that you've had in terms of implementing a process and a system?
I think the biggest learning is you have to bring people along with you. At the start of it, I was kind of put my head down and say, okay, this is what we're doing. This is how it's going to work now. And people like, well, someone missed that meeting or someone didn't check their inbox and they missed an email, whatever it might be. And like not having that visibility, like made them detractors in the like EMPS language, or MPS language, excuse me. It made them detractors. They didn't want to participate. They liked the old way. They didn't understand why things were changing. They didn't understand why, their resourcing was changing or whatever the question might have been. So, as we revised our process, we did that a lot, right? Like going from a 30-person team to 150-person team, you have to change the way you operate. You have to change the way you think. You have to rebuild things. You have to change the way your relationships work as well. So, we learned that, you have to bring people along with you. You have to understand what the stakeholders like about a system, what they don't like, what the creatives like about a certain system, what they don't like, what are the downsides to that, what are the things that you're testing and trying out, what are the results of those things. Like it's no different than like product testing. A process is a product because it's constantly evolving and iterating, right? It's constantly changing. So long as like you create that visibility for your partners, they will, and this ties back to the point on like creatives understanding the business. Like there's a level of ownership that develops, and all of a sudden they're excited about the new changes. They understand the rationale behind them, and they're ready for this new world and how things are going to get better. But if one day you just show up and say, "Well, this is how we work now," people are going to tell you to take a walk, and everyone loses in that situation because like your new process, whatever it might be, has failed already. Like no one's adopting it. And now you're back to the drawing board. So if you get people involved sooner, the output, regardless of whether it's a project, a task, or a process change, it's going to be 10 times more effective.
So the mantra, if you build it, they will come, does not ring true when it comes to building out new systems within an organization.
That is bullshit. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, really appreciate your time. It was super interesting to get into the inner workings of one of my favorite companies, honestly, HubSpot, and hear how you really built out that creative team there. So thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.